At 37,000 feet, United Flight 232 was in low workload cruise. Autopilot engaged, engines at steady power, the crew monitoring instruments but not actively controlling anything. They were scanning for problems they didn't expect to find. A violent bang, a shudder through the airframe. Not turbulence, something breaking. Warning lights illuminated across the panel. The number 2 engine instruments showed failure. Manageable. 14 seconds after the explosion, flight engineer Dvorak saw something that had never happened before. All 3 hydraulic pressure gauges at 0. "We've got no hydraulics," Dvorak said, the first time that sentence had ever been spoken on a DC-10 in flight. Every checklist, every simulator session, every trained response assumed at least one hydraulic system would survive. When the crew asked United Maintenance for guidance, they were told no procedure existed. The possibility was considered too remote to plan for. Hydraulics are the muscle system of a jet. They actuate every control surface: ailerons, elevator, rudder. Without hydraulic pressure, the crew could pull the yoke, push the pedals, and nothing would respond. The failure wasn't perception. They saw the gauges immediately. The failure was their action repertoire. Every trained response required hydraulics. Without them, their expertise had nothing to execute. This is expectation collapse. Not just a violation of what they expected, but the total absence of any procedure to follow. Every decision pathway their training had built led to the same dead end: restore hydraulics, and there was no way to do that. If every control you trained would stop responding, could you invent a way to fly with only engine power before you ran out of sky? What the crew had just encountered was a failure mode considered so improbable that no procedures existed, no simulators trained for it, and no regulations required preparing for it. That wasn't optimism. It was probabilistic risk assessment applied to a system with known spatial convergence in the tail, but where engineers calculated that the probability of debris striking that point with catastrophic energy was extremely remote. The DC-10 was designed under a clear certification rule. Any failure condition that would prevent safe flight and landing must be extremely improbable. To meet that standard, it had 3 independent hydraulic systems, each powered by a different engine and routed through different sections of the aircraft. Losing one system was expected. Even losing 2 was survivable. Engineers calculated that the probability of all 3 being disabled at once fell below the threshold where FAA rules required procedures, simulator training, or specific design countermeasures. Not impossible, just improbable enough that existing protections were considered sufficient. And that logic held, until an uncontained engine failure exploited the one place where geometry made independence fragile. All 3 hydraulic systems were routed separately through most of the aircraft. But in the tail section, where the vertical stabilizer attached to the horizontal stabilizer, all 3 lines converged. They ran along the front, center, and rear spars, within about 2 feet of each other, through the same confined structural corridor. When the number 2 engine's fan disc fractured, after a fatigue crack had grown undetected for more than a decade, fragments were expelled at extreme velocity. Debris exited the engine, tore through the tail structure, and severed all 3 hydraulic lines in the same impact zone. Within seconds, hydraulic pressure dropped to 0 across every system. This is common cause failure, when one event bypasses redundancy by striking a shared vulnerability. The pilots didn't just lose control. They lost the assumption that control loss had limits. The airplane didn't break physics. It exposed a gap in risk modeling, treating extremely remote failures as not requiring specific countermeasures, even when the consequences were catastrophic. And now the crew was flying an aircraft with no hydraulic control of flight surfaces, no procedure to follow, and no precedent for what came next. Minutes after the explosion severed all 3 hydraulic systems, United 232 was still at 37,000 feet. Nothing else had failed. The engines were running. The wings were intact. The cockpit was calm. But every procedure that assumed hydraulic control was now unusable. There was no checklist for total hydraulic loss, no simulator scenario, no train recovery path. So the crew began by testing what training told them should still work. Captain Al Haynes coordinated with air traffic control and declared an emergency. First Officer Bill Records monitored airspeed, altitude, and bank angle, guarding against an uncommanded stall. Flight engineer Al Dvorak tracked hydraulic pressure, electrical systems, and fuel state, searching for any control pathway that might still exist. They moved the control yoke. Nothing. They pressed the rudder pedals. Nothing. They tried elevator trim. No response. For several minutes, the aircraft remained controllable only in one way: engine power. That was when Dennis Fitch intervened. Fitch was an off-duty United Airlines DC-10 training instructor, seated in first class. When he heard the announcement about hydraulic failure, he sent a message forward through a flight attendant. He knew the DC-10's engine-driven systems intimately. He believed thrust might still influence the aircraft. Haynes accepted immediately. This mattered. Fitch wasn't summoned by rank. He volunteered expertise, and the cockpit accepted it. That decision reflected a principle United had only recently begun teaching: crew resource management. Authority yields to knowledge when survival is at stake. Fitch entered the cockpit and knelt on the floor between the pilot's seats. There was no fourth station. He reached for the throttles of engines 1 and 3, the outer engines. At first, nothing happened. Then Fitch added power to the left engine while holding the right steady. Seconds passed. The aircraft got slightly to the right. It was the first response they'd seen since the explosion. They had found a control path, but it came with consequences. Using thrust alone introduced a long-period oscillation known as a phugoid. As power increased, the aircraft climbed and lost airspeed. Lift decayed. The nose dropped. The aircraft accelerated into a dive, overshooting safe speed, then climbing again. Altitude swung by nearly 1,000 feet. Airspeed fluctuated between 180 and 250 knots. The crew couldn't dampen the motion directly. They had no elevators. They could only influence when the cycle peaked, by adjusting thrust. Haynes called out altitude targets. Records warned of impending stalls. Dvorak monitored engine limits. Fitch translated their voices into throttle movements, a 4-person distributed control system. For the next 38 minutes, Fitch made continuous micro-adjustments. His hands never left the throttles. Every few seconds, power up or power down. Not to stabilize flight, but to keep the oscillation from becoming unrecoverable. This was not planning. There were no options to compare. No decision tree. This was recognition prime decision-making. Fitch recognized the pattern. He mentally simulated the aircraft's response. He acted immediately. When the response differed from expectation, he updated the model and tried again. Each oscillation refined understanding. Each correction bought control, measured not in degrees per second, but in degrees per minute. Slow, unstable, but sufficient. The aircraft never stabilized, but became steerable. Degree by degree, United 232 began navigating towards Sioux City, nearly 100 miles away. They had invented control under cognitive overload. What they didn't yet know was whether anyone on the ground was preparing to meet them. While the cockpit was inventing control, Sioux City's emergency response teams were mobilizing on the ground, staging resources before full information arrived. At 15:20, United 232 declared an emergency, 40 minutes before impact. The fire chief escalated to Alert 3, the highest emergency level, authorizing mutual aid and triggering coordinated preparation across the airport. Ambulances and rescue units moved in from surrounding towns. Hospitals activated mass casualty plans. Fire crews staged foam trucks and heavy equipment, preparing simultaneously for fuel fire, structural breakup, and large numbers of injured survivors. ATC cleared the crew for any runway, an acknowledgement that precise directional control no longer existed. The pilots attempted to reach runway 31, the longest available surface. But with only limited influence over heading, the aircraft descended toward runway 22 instead, a closed runway with construction equipment staged along it. It wasn't controlled. It was where their remaining influence over the aircraft took them. No one had full information. No one waited for certainty. Fire crews, medical teams, airport operations, and mutual aid responders shared one operating assumption: prepare for mass casualties, uncontrolled impact, and fuel fire simultaneously. This is distributed cognition. Multiple independent agencies coordinating without centralized command, each executing specialized roles based on shared protocols, allowing rapid action when no single actor has complete information. By the time United 232 touched down, Sioux City had already positioned every available resource toward one goal: ensuring that whoever survived the impact would survive what came next. At 4 p.m., United 232 hit the ground at Sioux Gateway Airport, not as a landing, but as a high-energy impact with minimal control. The aircraft touched down right wing first, already yawed and rolling. The right main landing gear collapsed. The wing tore open. Fuel ignited. Within seconds, the DC-10 cartwheeled down the runway, breaking apart as it tumbled. Of the 296 people on board, 111 died. 185 survived. Survival wasn't random. It emerged from the interaction of physics, structure, human behavior, and time. As the aircraft disintegrated, different sections experienced different forces. The cockpit separated early. The tail section broke free and slid down the runway, largely intact. The center fuselage rotated violently and was quickly consumed by fire. The breakup occurred over hundreds of feet, not in a single abrupt stop, dissipating energy through destruction rather than transmitting it all directly into bodies. Fire erupted immediately from the ruptured right-wing fuel tank, but it didn't spread uniformly. Some sections burned within seconds. Others remained intact just long enough to create brief windows of survivability, measured in minutes, then seconds, as smoke filled the cabin. Survivors shared clear patterns documented by investigators: restraint use, brace position compliance, and location away from the primary fire zone. Many who died had survivable impact injuries, but succumbed to smoke inhalation before escape or rescue. This is where behavior mattered. Inside the cabin, Senior Flight Attendant Jan Brown and her crew executed evacuation commands they had drilled for years. Loud, repetitive, automatic. Survivors later described acting on instinct. The brace position, often dismissed by passengers, reduced head and torso injuries, prevented secondary impacts with seat structures, and kept people conscious long enough to escape. The aircraft's breakup created opportunity. Human compliance determined who could use it. Because emergency crews were already staged, fire suppression and rescue began almost immediately. Foam trucks reached the wreckage within seconds. Forced entry and triage began while some sections were still burning. The NTSB would later credit this rapid response as a significant factor in the survival rate. The crash created chaos, but preparation created time. And time, measured in seconds between fire and suppression, between smoke and rescue, was the difference between survival and death. United 232 didn't just end on a runway in Iowa. It accelerated lasting changes across aviation training, aircraft design, and emergency response. Before Sioux City, pilot training assumed that at least one hydraulic system would survive any failure. Total hydraulic loss was considered too improbable to simulate. Crew resource management training already existed at some airlines, including United, but it was not yet universal across the industry. United 232 shattered that assumption. This was a total systems failure. No checklist, no precedent, no existing procedure. The NTSB concluded that the crew's performance demonstrated the value of crew resource management itself. Clear communication, effective use of all available expertise, and shared decision-making under extreme uncertainty. Their performance wasn't achieved by abandoning training, but by applying CRM principles exactly as designed. After the crash, simulator training expanded. Airlines introduced scenarios where normal flight controls are degraded or unavailable, situations previously excluded from training because they were deemed too unlikely. Crews began practicing coordination under overload, managing partial information, and accepting imperfect solutions when ideal ones don't exist. United 232 also became a defining CRM case study. The integration of off-duty DC-10 instructor Dennis Fitch into the cockpit demonstrated how expertise could cross authority boundaries without creating chaos. That lesson accelerated CRM adoption across the global aviation industry. Design standards changed as well. The FAA mandated reviews of hydraulic system routing to identify convergence points and improve physical separation. Engine fan disk inspection procedures were strengthened, with stricter retirement criteria and improved crack detection methods. Redundancy alone was no longer sufficient. Spatial independence became a design requirement. This rapid translation, from catastrophe to curriculum and design, demonstrates institutional learning, a system extracting lessons from failure and encoding them into layered defenses. The result was organizational learning from catastrophe, a measurable increase in safety and capability earned because the system survived an extreme event and permanently institutionalized its lessons. United 232 forced aviation to confront an uncomfortable truth. You can't design away every failure, but you can train humans and systems to adapt when design collapses. That's why this wasn't just a miracle. It was a lesson written in wreckage and carried forward in how we fly today.